Born into a family of physicians, Marie always had a passion for medicine. As a child, she would often assist her parents in their practice, soaking up every bit of knowledge she could. As she grew older, Marie became increasingly fascinated with the human mind. She studied psychology in college, and eventually landed a job as a nurse at a local psychiatric hospital. Marie had always been a kind and empathetic nurse, but her work in the institution, Deadwood Psychiatric Hospital, had taken a toll on her. She had been assigned to the long-term care unit, where the patients were so severely disturbed that they would never be released. Day after day, Marie watched as they languished in their padded cells, forgotten by the outside world. It was on a night in the spring of 1953, a night when all hell opened up as the sky fractured by lightning and broke loose, and Nurse Marie had just started her shift at Deadwood. She had been warned about the long-term care unit and the dangerous and unstable patients who resided there. Apparently, the ward had hummed with terrible outbursts and bizarre behaviors during the day. It was a full moon that night, and it had affected them before the sun even set, to hear the day nurses tell it. But nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to witness. As she walked down the dimly lit corridor, she heard strange whispering sounds emanating from one of the patient rooms. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if it was just her imagination playing tricks on her, but the whispers grew louder and more insistent. She cautiously approached the door and peeked inside, only to find an empty room. Naturally, this unnerved her. After all, she was certain she'd heard whispers. Yet here she stood, in an empty room with nothing but the sound of the storm raging outside to greet her. But as she turned to leave, she felt a cold breeze brush past her, sending shivers down her spine. Suddenly, she heard a chilling voice whisper in her ear,
"Don't turn around."
Paralyzed with fear, Nurse Marie slowly turned her head, only to see a figure standing in the doorway. It was a patient from the ward for lifers, dressed in a tattered hospital gown and with wild, tangled hair. His eyes were glazed over and his expression was twisted with madness. Nurse Marie gasped, and when she did so, the troubled man grinned and then vanished like a flicker of lightning. Her heart began to pound, and the man was soon replaced by another apparition. There was a small pool of blood on the floor, and a patient was crouched in the corner, his back facing her. Nurse Marie cautiously stepped out into the hallway, softly calling out to the patient. But there was no response. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if she should call for backup, but something inside her compelled her to investigate. As she got closer, she could see that the patient had a sharp object in his hand, and he was muttering to himself incoherently. She tried to reason with him, but he seemed to be in a trance-like state, completely oblivious to her presence. Suddenly, the patient turned around and lunged at her with the sharp object, grazing her face and opening a slash of blood across her cheek. She stumbled backwards, clutching her bleeding wound, her heart racing with fear. But as she regained her balance, she realized that something was different. The patient had changed. His eyes were no longer glazed over with madness, and he seemed to be looking at her with a sense of clarity. He slowly got up and handed her the sharp object, whispering a single word in her ear.
"Run."
Nurse Marie stood locked in her place, whispering a brief prayer and sending it to fight with the thunder in its effort to find heaven. She could not run. It was against the rules to abandon a patient in crisis. The patient lunged at her, and she stumbled backwards, knocking over a nearby tray of medical supplies. She scrambled to her feet and called out at the top of her voice for help from orderlies, or nurses, or anybody who might be nearby. She raised her shoulders and squared her body to face her attacker. She was so terrified, she no longer felt the sting of the injury to her face. But then just like that, he was nowhere to be seen. Vanished, just like the other mysterious smiling patient before him. Suddenly, the lights went out, leaving her in total darkness. Nurse Marie felt a cold breath on the back of her neck, and she realized that she was not alone. It took all her courage and another whispered prayer to turn her head and see who was there. But there was no one. Or at least, whatever horror the corridor held on that stormy night could not be seen by Nurse Maria. She tried to run, but she stumbled and fell, her flashlight rolling away from her grasp. In the darkness, she heard whispers again, growing louder and more insistent, like a chorus of demons calling out to her. She knew she was about to meet her fate. As she closed her eyes and waited for the inevitable, she felt a sudden rush of air and heard the sound of footsteps running away from her. Shaken to her core, Nurse Marie made her way back to the main hallway, vowing never to enter the ward for lifers again if it could possibly be avoided. She walked away and the vicious storm outside was over by the time she reached the nurse's station. She heard the whispers echoing in her mind, haunting her dreams for years to come. But as the years went by, Marie began to feel increasingly overwhelmed by the pain and suffering she witnessed on a daily basis. She worked long hours with little rest, and often found herself consumed by a sense of hopelessness. She also grew more and more bitter at the pronounced scar forever slicing across her face, never to disappear. But the whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. Marie began to feel a strange, almost hypnotic pull toward the source of the whispers, and in return, she would whisper her little prayers. Before she knew it, she found herself standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by an eerie, otherworldly presence. From that moment on, Marie was changed. She became withdrawn and secretive, rarely speaking to anyone except in hushed whispers. Patients and colleagues alike grew wary of her, sensing a strange energy emanating from her that they could not explain. Rumors began to swirl about Marie, with some claiming that she had made a pact with supernatural forces in order to gain access to hidden knowledge or power. Others suggested that she had become possessed by the spirits of the patients she had cared for, doomed to wander the halls of the hospital for eternity. Marie's bitterness and resentfulness mounted, feeling as though society had abandoned her along with the patients she was caring for. She began to devise secret experiments on the lifers, determined to uncover the root of their mental illnesses and find a way to cure them. As the weeks and months went by, Marie's experiments grew more and more extreme. She would administer untested drugs, perform dangerous surgeries, and even subject the patients to intense psychological manipulation. Some of the lifers grew worse under her care, while others simply disappeared. As her patients began to die off, Marie became isolated from her colleagues. She spent long hours alone in the hospital's abandoned wings, whispering frantic prayers to herself in her desperation to find a cure for what she believed to be the root of all mental illness. It wasn't long before her dark experiments were discovered, and Marie was fired in disgrace. But by then, it was too late. The damage had been done, and the souls of her victims were forever trapped in the hospital's walls. She was reported to the authorities, and the once kind nurse was arrested and charged with multiple counts of assault and murder. Marie was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, where she would die, cold, scarred, and alone. Whatever the truth may be, one thing is certain: the woman now known as the Whispering Woman remains a chilling and enigmatic figure, haunting the dreams and nightmares of those who dare to cross her path. On the night of a full moon in the spring, the staff of Deadwood Psychiatric Hospital were on high alert. Rumors had been circulating for weeks about strange occurrences in the long-term care unit, and many of the staff were convinced that the restless spirits of the past were haunting the halls once again. As the night wore on, the tension grew. Patients in the other wards reported hearing whispering voices and seeing shadowy figures lurking in the shadows. But it was in the long-term care unit that the true terror lay. There, in the darkest corner of the ward, a figure appeared. It was a ghostly woman, dressed in a nurse's uniform, with long, tangled hair obscuring her face. She moved slowly and deliberately, her whispers barely audible but chilling to the bone. Some swore that the entity was whispering dark prayers, but no one could be certain. The patients trembled with fear, for they recognized the ghostly figure as none other than the Whispering Woman. They knew her story well, how she had terrorized the ward in the 1950s, subjecting them to cruel and unusual experiments in the name of science. Now, it seemed, she had returned to exact her revenge. And she was not alone. The patients in the long-term care unit reported feeling cold drafts and hearing strange noises in their cells. They claimed that they could feel the presence of other ghosts, the victims of the Whispering Woman's experiments who had died in agony. The staff of the institution were at a loss as to how to deal with the situation. They tried to dismiss the reports as hallucinations or the overactive imaginations of the patients, but the sightings of the ghostly figure were too frequent and too consistent to be ignored. In the end, the institution was forced to shut down the long-term care unit and move the remaining patients to a different facility. But even now, years later, there are those who claim that they can still hear the whispers of the Whispering Woman, and that the ghostly figure still haunts the halls of the old institution.
In the halls of the hospital, where the sick and the dying lay, there lurks a ghostly woman, whose whispers lead astray. Her hair is long and tangled, her face forever obscured, and when she speaks, her voice is soft, but her secrets are secured. They call her the Whispering Woman, a nurse from a time gone by. But now she haunts these empty halls, and her victims cannot hide. She whispers tales of terror, and her whispers carry far. For those who hear her ghostly voice will never escape her scar. So if you wander down these halls and hear her whispers low, remember, friend, to stay away, lest she make you her next foe.